Hi, I'm Naomi Gerstel. I am a member of Northampton Neighbors Speaker Series, and the Speaker Series is the committee that chooses the wonderful speakers that we have, including today's. And what I'm going to do today is first tell you just a little bit about Northampton Neighbors, and then tell you a little bit about logistics for today, and then tell you a little bit about Jackson Katz, who's our wonderful speaker today, and then Jackson will talk. Northampton Neighbors is a marvelous organization, as I assume most of you know. It's part of an international village movement. It's a nonprofit organization based primarily on volunteers to help older people live independent, engaged, and joyful lives. Um, we have now, amazingly, after 8 years, 2,200 members. We offer all kinds of services from a listserv controlled by our members, which offers things like how to get somebody to fix your stove or write a will, to how to get somebody to help you redo a necklace, which actually happened. We have a biking group, a hiking group, a gardening group, a cooking group, lots of social events. The last Surgeon General talked about the loneliness epidemic. He didn't know about Northampton Neighbors. It's a great organization and it's completely free. We offer rides to grocery stores, to medical appointments, all sorts of services, and you don't pay for anything. We seek volunteers and we seek donations, but do not charge a fee. I am honored to introduce Dr. Jackson Katz, who we are so honored to have. He's a world-renowned author who has spoken all over the world. He's a scholar and activist, and he is a major figure in the growing movement for gender inequality and the reduction of violence against women. He was an architect of the bystander movement, co-founder of Mentors of Violence Prevention, and more recently, a co-founder of the Young Men's Research Program. He is the creator of numerous award-winning documentaries, including Tough Guys, which I love and have seen many times, and I assume you have as well, which is now coming out in its third version. They're working on it now, I think. And he's lectured all over the place. He's author of 3 books, including the Macho Paradox, which is a classic in the field. And he has coming out March 19th from Bloomsbury a book called Every Man, Why Violence Against Women is a Man's Issue. A men's issue. He has a TED Talk, he has Substack. I could go on, but I think it's better that he go on and on. So take it away, Jackson.
Thank you so much, Naomi. Let me say it's a great honor for me to be introduced by Naomi Gerstel. Naomi is a legendary figure in my family and with my wife. She's a mentor of my wife and a great sociologist. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this. I also want to say Northampton Neighbors, what a fantastic organization, and I mean I'm just privileged to be part of your community for this brief moment in time. And I want to say something about that moment in time because we live in a wild era, and the fire hose of crazy in the time of Trump is just hard to keep up with, to say the least. And even since the time that Naomi and her colleagues and I sat down and tried to figure out a title and a framing for this talk, just so many things have happened between then and now, and it's impossible to keep up. Just a couple of examples: the Epstein files, the DOJ releasing the Epstein files, which is so much to talk about there. And then there's the U.S. and Israel attacking Iran and all the conflagration in the Middle East. I'm just pointing it out because let's historicize this moment. We do live in an unbelievable time, and there's so much happening. And I also want to say that feminist voices are more important than ever. They've always been important, but they're more important than ever. And a good deal of what I'm going to be talking about today is informed by feminist thinking, and it's really important, especially when men like myself have a stage, if you will, or have a public platform to talk about various issues that we acknowledge that women's leadership, both intellectual, cultural, political, women's leadership has made possible just an incredibly rich conversation, not just about women and girls' lives, but about men and boys' lives. The last since the 1990s, 30 plus years, there's been an incredible sort of outpouring of research and advocacy and journalistic discussions about men and masculinities that are a product of and have been informed by, feminist scholarship and activism. And I think it's really important, again, as a man, that I acknowledge that, especially here we are in Women's History Month, right? So it's Women's History Month. And this is, as you know, I'm sure that your people in your group who pay attention to these sorts of matters know that the right has been attacking things like Women's History Month because they obviously understand that educated, thoughtful women, but also are a threat to their hegemony or to their power. But also, it's not just women who have been in women's history that that is a threat to their power. It's men who are actually thoughtful enough and knowledgeable enough to challenge the patriarchal norms that are perpetuating some of these injustices. So I have to say, as a man, I'm an example of that. That my work, that some of which Naomi referenced just a few moments ago, is so deeply indebted to feminist women's leadership, and my work and many others' work in men and masculinities across the various categories of race, ethnicity, geography, global north, global south. This incredible, ferment that's been happening is also a product of all that. Now, let's get into the substance of my talk here, if you will, and let me say, I'm going to give you a few headlines, and then I'm going to give you some things to think about each headline. We can't do it comprehensive justice in this space and time, but I just want to give some airtime to a range of different both events and ways of thinking about those events that tie together the themes of my talk here. Because Masculinities, Misogyny, and Violence, Notes on the Crisis in Private and Public Life is a pretty ambitious title for a talk of 30 plus minutes. So I'm going to start with January 6th, 2021. January 6th, so many people understand that event as a kind of a white riot, like that the animating energy behind January 6th was racist, was white people who were upset about the growing racial and ethnic integration of the country and the immigration streams that have created a much more heterogeneous country than they're comfortable with, and that the sort of the animating energy behind both January 6th and Trumpism is primarily about race. And of course, race is a critical and constitutive part of right-wing populism, but it's not just about race. It's also about gender. It's also about masculinity. So it's not just about whiteness. It's about white masculinity. And the discourse coming out of January 6th is an example of how far we have to come as a culture to be actually having the discussions about the intersection between race and gender in the way that I'm about to share with you a brief piece. So on January 6th, of the people arrested that day for committing crimes, 93% were white, and 86% were men. But almost nobody in the mainstream or left conversation talked about the 86% men figure. So you had all kinds of conversations in, for example, podcasts and progressive media, not just in the mainstream, whatever that means anymore, media, but in progressive media, where there was little discussion, if any, about the fact that it was 86% men. And to me, that's just an obvious omission, and it's a failure to name the problem. And a basic feminist concept is you have to name a problem if you want to solve it. And we have to say out loud that it's not just about racism, it's also about men and men feeling decentered by decades and generations now of feminist transformation and feminist challenges to white male centrality, both in the family and in the larger society. And also at the LGBTQ revolution, and the challenges that it has posed to heteronormative heterosexual centrality. I know that sounds like highfalutin academic language, but let's be honest, what's happened since the 1960s, and again, there's antecedents to all of this, but what's happened since the 1960s is all these progressive social movements that have been seeking to gain, rights and articulate the aspirations of people of color and women and LGBTQ folks. All of them are trying to dislodge white male power, which has been, obviously at the top of the pyramid for a long, long time. And white men are fighting back, and right-wing populism is the fight. And January 6th was an example of this. And by the way, one other piece, so much of the knowledge that we have and so much of the experience we have over the past generation in working with abusive men or men who use abuse in their relationships, usually court mandated. But and again, that's also, they work hand in glove with the with what used to be called the battered women's movement, but the movements for that have been organized since the 1970s around women's experience of violence in relationships. Anyhow, one thing that I apply to much of my work in the political realm is understandings that have come out of work in the micro realm of the family. And so I'll give you an example of what I mean. The typical man who uses abuse in a heterosexual relationship, or who abuses his wife or his girlfriend, it's typically not that he's lost control and acted out in some impulsive way, but it's often a pattern of power and control that he's using force to assert, gain, or maintain his control or his authority in the relationship. Now that we know this from decades of working with men, it's usually an intentional choice. It doesn't mean that men don't have anger management problems. It doesn't mean that some men don't have drinking problems. Obviously, all of that's there, but the choice to use violence is a choice, and it's often a choice used instrumentally to gain or maintain control or to punish a woman for her transgressing against his authority. Now, what was January 6th? Well, the right couldn't win an election in normal democratic nonviolent means, so they decided that they were going to use force to take control in a way that they couldn't do it through the system. And that has direct analog to what I'm talking about in terms of abuse in relationships. I mean, when's the last time you heard anybody talk about any of this, anything close to the mainstream of conversation in the incredible outpouring of commentary and analysis about January 6th that we've seen for the past 5 years? Point number 2, the 2024 election, which was a complete hypermasculine spectacle. I don't know how many of you watched the Republican National Convention in July of 2024, but it was just it was like masculinity, white masculinity especially, but not exclusively, on steroids. I mean, this happened, by the way, shortly after Donald Trump's assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania. So there was a even added context of the conquering hero coming in after having been, his life being threatened. And by the way, he entered the arena. When he entered the arena, he entered to the music of James Brown's classic, "It's a man's world." I mean, it was so over the top. And by the way, right around that time, the late Charlie Kirk made a comment, and he said, a widely circulated comment, and he said, after the assassination attempt, if you're a man, the assassination attempt against Donald Trump, if you're a man and you don't support Donald Trump now, you're not a man. So in other words, the idea that somehow gender and masculinity was an ancillary factor in the 2024 election is kind of ridiculous. I think it was central. It was and the Republican Party was well aware of this. By the way, that was the convention, the 2024 RNC, where Hulk Hogan ripped off his shirt on screen. You remember that one? He ripped off his shirt. In addition, speaker after speaker went up to the podium and said what a real man Donald Trump was. He was, the Dana White, the head of the UFC, said that Donald Trump is the biggest badass that he's ever seen. We have to talk about this. And I have to say, I'm just for what it's worth, it's really hard to get some of this conversation into the discourse. I mean, people now have been talking in a way that they weren't talking, because now Donald Trump has been in office for, whatever, since, well, actually, he's been in the mainstream of our political life for a long time, over a decade. So there is more conversation than there used to be. But even to this day, getting some of this into mainstream conversation is more of an uphill fight than you might think. Now, Trump himself didn't come out of nowhere, right? So people often ask me, well, is this about Donald Trump and Donald Trump's personal, crazy, or he's a bit of a cartoonish figure, and is that just a one-off kind of thing? And it's not true that it's a one-off, because let's be honest, Donald Trump is an exaggeration of existing phenomena in American political life for the last at least 50 years. And my colleagues and I at the Media Education Foundation and Peter Hutchison and Lucas Sabian made a film that was called The Man Card, that came out in 2020, and then we updated it in 2024. The Man Card, 50 Years of Gender Power in the American Presidency, was looking at the ways in which Donald Trump was a more exaggerated version of what's been happening over the last number of decades in American presidential politics. Just a couple of data points to reinforce the idea that gender and masculinity is central to this, to presidential politics. In 2024, Trump won among white men 60-37. But there's a class breakdown, which is also important to acknowledge. There's a class breakdown within the white male vote. In the among college-educated white men, Trump beat Harris by 50 to 47%. But among high school educated white men, he beat Harris by 69 to 29%. That's 40 percentage points. And it's hard to imagine the Democrats winning national elections when they lose so overwhelmingly among the white working class. And that's another topic for another day. But I just wanted just to point out that there's a gendered aspect. It's not just the white working class. It's also, you have to break that down by gender. And obviously one of my focuses is on white men and white working class men. And I think that the difference between the 50 to 47 in the college educated white men and the 69 to 29 in high school educated white men is something we should be having a conversation about. What are those class differences, and what are the ways in which the messages of someone like Trump and his administration are sending, the cultural narrative that they've constructed, the performances that they do, as well as the policies that they pursue? What are the ways that those land differently based on class? And by the way, that should also be applied to the women's vote and the white women's vote, which is very, very class divided as well. Okay, third point, the ICE raids and the anti-immigrant, extremely aggressive and violent anti-immigrant policies of the Trump administration. One of the ways that the Trump regime has tried to sell the need for their policy has very old roots in racist captivity narratives that date back to the 17th century and more recent. In the United States, the captivity narratives about white settlers being, especially settler women, being captured by what was called, savage Native American men, and the need for white men to mobilize and use violence to rescue the women that had been taken by the Native Americans, as if the central issue of that time was white vulnerability to Native American violence. And the reason why I'm referencing this in the context of this discussion is that you hear so often in Donald Trump's speeches and his off-the-cuff remarks about how he invokes the dangerous dark-skinned men who are a threat to, essentially, to white women. They're bringing their rapists. Mexico, they're bringing their rapists. This is also what's happening in Europe. It's been happening for a number of years in Europe, is the anti-immigrant sentiment in Europe, and the ways in which the far right has been mobilized by right-wing parties is through this threat that dark-skinned immigrant men are posing to white women. This is true in the UK as well. So in other words, we have to talk about the way in which white men have been mobilized as sort of defenders of and protectors of white women in the face of dark-skinned men, because we're kidding ourselves if we don't think that that's an incredibly important part of the energy behind the rise of right-wing populism, both in Europe and here in the United States. It's another example of an incredible sort of synergy between racism and sexism. Now, moving on, Stephen Miller made a comment in January in a conversation with Jake Tapper on CNN, and it was in the context of Trump's stated desire to control or to take control of Greenland. Remember that? I mean, it's like seems like a lifetime ago, even though it was just a really recent. Miller said this. He said, "We live in a world in which you can talk all you want about international niceties and everything else, but we live in a world, in a real world, that is governed by strength, that is governed by force, that is governed by power. These are the iron laws of the world since the beginning of time." Now, I'm glad that Stephen Miller said the quiet part out loud, because by articulating that, he was basically giving away the game. In other words, if everything is about power and everything is about the exercise of power, where does that end? And where does it begin? It also begins in the family as well, because that's what we know from working with men who are abusive in a relational context, is that force ultimately, if ultimately the source of power is the ability to physically dominate, then forget about egalitarian relationships, because if men continue to have physical size and strength advantages over women, then ultimately that's just the way the world works. They can assert their needs and assert their dominance using force. By the way, just a data point that might or might not be of interest to folks. Stephen Miller grew up listening to right-wing talk radio. One of the constitutive parts of Stephen Miller's basically fascist education was listening to Rush Limbaugh on the radio and Larry Elder. And if you're not familiar with Larry Elder was a LA-based African-American right-wing talk radio host and prominent personality on the right. And so Stephen Miller credits them with being really important early influences. I'm going to skip ahead in the interest of time and opening up space for a conversation when we get there. And I'm going to talk about the Epstein files, or one of the issues that's brought up by the Epstein files. And again, we're only at the early stages of what's going to be decades worth of analysis and books that people are going to write and conversations that people are going to have and courses that people are going to teach, because there's just so much going on. But I want to focus on one piece, and I've written about this recently. It's this notion of this such a thing as an Epstein class, and it's sort of a class first analysis of the men and a handful of women around Jeffrey Epstein. And it's the Epstein class is this, transnational class of elites who are, powerful, wealthy, or they're prominent scientists or political figures who are inhabiting a world of incredible privilege and are seemingly acting out of complete impunity and complete callousness, but because they are powerful, they can get away with it. Okay, so and which is obviously part of the story. Okay, the part of the story of that the Epstein files reveals. But as many feminists have been saying, and many people in the domestic and sexual violence movements have been saying, this is not unique to upper class men, and focusing on the class elements of the men in the Epstein files scandal means that you're kind of, in a sense, either erasing or pushing aside the larger point that gender-based violence is pervasive in our society at all levels of class. And we live in a culture that completely sexually objectifies and dehumanizes young women and girls. We live in a culture with an incredible pornography industry that caters to men's sexual objectification and exploitation of women and girls in the heterosexual porn that's marketed to young men and boys. And to focus exclusively on class and not to talk about the larger culture that gave rise to the sexual exploitation, I mean, it just completely misses the moment, if you will. Now, one way of thinking about that is by using a comparison to another shocking case that some of you are familiar with, the Pellico mass rape case in France. And you might be following that Giselle Pellico has just published a memoir, and she's been out speaking about it, and she's an incredible icon of women's strength and resilience in the face of incredible abuse and violation. But anyhow, the Pellico case, which first broke about 5 years ago, was the man, Dominique Pellico, who had drugged his wife of 50 years and was arranging to have dozens and dozens, upwards of 70 men, raping her unconscious body. And then that was discovered and became a big, huge story, both in France and then globally. And one of the things that many people pointed out was the ordinary nature of so many of the men who were eventually 50 of them were convicted of raping Giselle Pellico. But the ordinary nature of these men was part of the story, which is people saying, oh my God, how did, these guys were, firefighters, farm workers, soldiers, journalists, nurses, forklift operators, etc. Many were fathers or grandfathers. They range in age from like 24 to 74, something like that. And it astounded a lot of people, and it obviously disturbed many people, and especially, but not exclusively, women, because the very ordinariness of these men leads us to ask the question: is it not just? In other words, it opens up the possibility for having a conversation that this is not, that rape and sexual assault is not just about individual pathology, but that there's something more systemic about it. There's something deeper that has to be looked at in the way we socialize boys, the norms that we have in our societies, the role of the porn culture in desensitizing and desensitizing men and dehumanizing women, etc. And yet, in much of the conversation, or if not the vast majority of the conversation about the Pellico rapists, there was very little overt discussion about class. It was about individuals who come from working class and middle class backgrounds, some of whom had domestic and sexual violence experiences as victims and survivors in their own histories, as well as some who had domestic violence convictions as perpetrators in their personal histories. But it was personalized and individualized rather than a class analysis. So in other words, in the Epstein class conversation, it's about wealthy men, and class is privileged over gender in that way. But when it came to the Pellico case, class wasn't discussed, and it was talked about as individual men who either had problems or were ordinary and average. And by the way, in the French media, the nickname that this case developed was, and I don't speak French, so pardon me if I'm going to botch this, Monsieur Tout le Monde, which is Mr. Everyman. So that the nickname of the Pellico case in French media was Mr. Everyman. And I say that because my book that just about to be published on March 19th by Bloomsbury that Naomi referenced is called Everyman: Why Violence Against Women is a Men's Issue. And by the way, I start my book by talking about the Pellico case, but I also make it clear that I came up with this title way before I heard about the Pellico case. But it just happened to be a coincidence, but I think a positive coincidence, because I think we have to talk about the ways in which all men in patriarchal societies, in our society, and young men and boys are being socialized into a certain kind of manhood. And that if we want to dramatically reduce the rates of domestic and sexual violence, we have to think about the ways that we can affect that socialization and those norms and the institutional structures that have been built up around them for forever. Finally, I'm just going to have one last point. It's about the Young Men Research Project that Naomi referenced as well. I started with a group of my colleagues, an organization 2 years ago called the Young Men Research Project, because we could see what was happening in terms of the young men's vote and young men's potential sliding to the right in terms of supporting Donald Trump and the Republican Party in the 2024 election. And the goal of our group initially was to produce research about young men's voting habits and behaviors and beliefs, as well as to push both the Democratic Party, but also journalists, writers, people in the commentariat to think critically about the young men's vote and what needed to be, what people on the left side of the House needed to do to forestall what we could see was a growing move to the right by young men. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. Young men moved to the right in the 2024 election, and in some cases dramatically so. And look what happened. Look what happened. By the way, the Republican Party and the Trump campaign in particular was well aware of all of this. They outspent the Democrats 10-1 in outreach to young men. Yes, it was Donald Trump going on the Joe Rogan show and a dozen other podcasts with large male audiences, and especially young male audiences. That wasn't the only piece of it, but they did understand that we are living in a new environment, a new media ecosphere, that the old way of, writing think pieces in the Atlantic and op-eds in the New York Times and having chat shows on TV that talk about politics is not the way that young people are processing political information, especially young men, and that you have to go into those spaces and you have to talk real, if you will, with young men if you want to have any hope of addressing their concerns. Let me just also say, young men, and I'm making a wildly general statement here, but young men on a range of political policy issues are progressive. 2/3 of them, for example, support abortion rights. They very overwhelming support for labor unions, opposition to the United States policy in vis-a-vis Israel, Palestine. There's so many issues where young people, and including young men, are not at all on board with right-wing and Republican ideology, but they voted for Donald Trump. And my argument, and I've been saying this for 35 years, is it's not about policy, it's not about ideology primarily. It's about narrative and story and identity. And I've been saying, and I'll say it right now, that the left and the progressive movement and the Democratic Party even needs to create narratives that include young white men as well as young men of color in a positive and aspirational story about our society and where we can go. Because the right is telling a story that has been persuasive, sadly, to a lot of young men, which is that progressives and feminists and anti-racist folks hate them, especially young white men, and they don't care about your problems, they don't care about your struggles. All this is BS, but it's very, very persuasive in the absence of a counter story. And I'm going to leave you with one data point that I hope connects some of the stuff that I've been talking about, and then we'll open up the floor for any kind of pushback, questions, concerns that people might have. I've been part of the men's health movement for a long time. What is the men's health movement? Well, the men's health movement is a way of thinking about men's health, emotional health, physical health, sexual health, mental health. In other words, health in all its aspects. But the men's health movement is a way of thinking about the ways that cultural beliefs and attitudes about masculinity and masculinities shape men's both risk-taking behaviors and potentially self-harming behaviors, but also impede their ability to, or felt permission to get help, to go to the doctor, to go to the dentist, to get into therapy. In other words, you have to look at the cultural ideologies about masculinity if you have any hope of addressing men's health in a sophisticated way. Well, the men's health movement is a direct outgrowth of the feminist-led women's health movement, one of the key moments of which was the publication in 1972 in Boston of the Our Bodies, Ourselves by the Boston Women's Health Book Collective, which was an attempt a very important early attempt to look at the ways in which cultural beliefs about femininity and women's experience shaped their health behaviors and outcomes, and the fact of the health delivery system or the healthcare delivery system being set up not for their interests. Well, the men's health movement, although it's much smaller than the women's health movement, is a direct outgrowth of that movement. And so many of the great things that have been happening today in terms of men's health are directly a product of feminist leadership and advocacy. And I'll just give you one example. There's a growing conversation among men, this is global, about mental health and about the need for men to feel permission to seek help about their mental health. You have prominent athletes in Europe and Australia and the United States coming forward, in this case, prominent male athletes saying, look, I'm a successful athlete, I'm at the highest level in my sport, but look at me, I have panic attacks and I need help, and it's okay. This is all really good, okay? It's all really good that we're doing this and that young men are hearing this, and that hopefully we're going to have some generational change around the acceptance of coming forward. But I think it's important to say that movement that's created so much of a healthy sort of paradigm for young men and for men more generally is a result of feminist leadership. And I think that's a really good argument to make to people who argue, I think ignorantly, that feminism hates men, or men like me who are pro-feminist somehow are self-hating men. This is just total BS. And I think it needs to be said. And I think it needs to be said especially by men. So if there are men listening to this who haven't yet used your voice, I think we need a whole lot more men who are willing to say some of this stuff. I think we need a whole lot more men who are willing to speak out loudly about men's violence against women and men's mistreatment of women. It's not fair for us to always outsource that to women and women's leadership, because women's leadership has been incredible and world historical in its transformative impacts in this area as well as so many others for a long time. But even though there has been an outpouring of men's advocacy and activism, it's nowhere near meeting the moment. And as we live in a society that has gone down this sort of fascist road because of white men who are so obsessed with regaining control, now more than ever, we need more men who are willing to join those women and have a constructive dialogue and change the paradigm and change the cultural norms. So that's my piece, and I'll stop now and open up the floor for any concerns, questions, or comments.
Thank you so much. That was a terrific talk, one we need to hear. We're going to now turn to the Q&A, and we're going to use chat. And what we're going to do is enter your question on chat, and then I will read it to Jackson. I also wanted to tell you that our next speaker is Peggy Gillespie, author of the book called Authentic Selves, Celebrating Trans and Non-Binary People and Their Families, on April 3rd from 3 to 4 p.m. More information will be coming soon. So let's begin the Q&A. And a bunch of people sent me questions, some from people on the Speakers Committee, and I thought I would start with some of those questions and then open it up for a broader conversation. So Jane Fleischman asked, and this ties directly to part of your conversation in interesting ways. With the Epstein files in the news, the possibility of prosecution for high-ranking elected U.S. officials involved seems rather bleak. What do you see as the future of accountability for sexual violence if the men at the top are not held accountable for their actions? Jackson?
Yeah, this is, it's an important question. I'll just say, like so many other questions that people will likely have, I can't do it full justice because there's too much to say about some of this subject matter. But I would say this is the big question, accountability. The vast majority of men, for example, who commit sexual assault are never held accountable. So it's not just about wealthy and powerful men at the top of the socioeconomic system. It's like the percentage of men who commit rape versus the percentage of men who are prosecuted for rape versus the percentage of men who actually go to jail or prison for rape is infinitesimally small. So the likelihood of a man committing rape being held accountable for it is very small, regardless of his social class. I think that's a point that has to be made. So I think we have to reconcile ourselves to the fact that the current laws around how do you prove rape and how do you deprive someone's their freedom. What is the evidentiary basis for depriving someone of their freedom? And not just the evidentiary base, but in terms of getting juries to convict people based on our current social norms and understandings of responsibility, we've got a long way to go. So I would say that we can't lean on just legal accountability as the only measure of success of addressing these issues. I think we need to think about prevention much more than just legal accountability. But I do agree that it sends the message if people get away with, I mean, look, Donald Trump was reelected in 2024, even after being found liable by a Manhattan jury for sexually abusing E. Jean Carroll. And the judge in the case explained that under New York state law, sexual abuse was equivalent to rape in many states. And he was found liable by a jury of doing that. And he was re-elected president of the United States with 77 million votes. So part of what we have to deal with is there are millions and millions of Americans who are either so desensitized or so prioritizing other issues that they're not going to be on board with the changes that some of us think need to happen. And so I think we have to define success a little bit differently. I hope that that's at least somewhat useful as an answer.
Good answer. There's also a question from Sarah Lennox, and she wrote, and this is also before hearing your talk, I have read that boys and young men seem to be in trouble these days. Do you agree? And if so, what do you think is the reason? And do you think there is any way as a society we might address it?
I'm sorry, the last part, some ways the society
might address it.
Oh my goodness. Yes. This itself is a huge sort of cultural debate. Is like, how much do we center men and young men's problems? And on the one side, because there's a whole conversation happening about that, of like, we need to focus on young men, but then there's the sexist, the implication that somehow sexism and misogyny and men's violence against women and structural barriers to women and girls, achievement needs to be somehow pushed aside because we now need to focus on men and boys. And so this is a contentious issue, to say the least. And I have to say, my colleagues and I at the Media Education Foundation, my friend and colleague Jeremy Earp and I were working on writing, Tough Guys 3, the update of our original film that came out in 2000, Tough Guys, and we're addressing this very question. Let me just say, I've taken the position over the years that there's two poles of debate, if you will, around the young men question, and then on one side, and the sexism and misogyny question on the other. And the two poles are on one side, people are saying we need to focus on men and young men and their struggles, emotional struggles, relational struggles, loneliness epidemic, increasing atomization of everyday experience, as well as the economic precarity that so many young men find themselves in. There's a whole range of issues. Okay, so we need to focus on that. And we really can't get into the sexism and the misogyny piece and men's violence against women, because we have to focus first on men's personal, emotional, relational, and economic needs on the one hand. And then you have on the other side more sort of political feminist thinkers and activists, and I would include myself in this category, well, who say you can't just focus on young men's emotional needs and relational needs and just overlook the fact that we live in a patriarchal culture where women and girls are the primary the class that's being primarily subordinated by those structures. You can't just look at, and my argument is you're going to do both at the same time. It's a false choice. So I've been saying this in meetings and in my writing for a long time. You've got to do both at the same time. Fortunately, there is a solution that includes both, because if you have more progressive social policy, that you're going to help boys, if you elect progressive candidates at all levels who are going to pass family leave and medical care and and universal health care and all these things, it's going to benefit dramatically young men and improve their life chances at the same time that it helps to advance gender justice and gender equality. So I think you have to do both at the same time. I also want to say one last thing. This notion of crisis in masculinity, which I've been a part of, writing about, thinking about, theorizing about, is a perpetual thing. Every time there's major moves forward by women, every time there's organized feminist movements that challenge the centrality of male authority, there is a crisis in masculinity as a result. In other words, it upends men's position when women's position changes. And so this is a perpetual. And then technology as well. The technological changes, as they happen, they create all kinds of social disruption, which creates potential crises in certain kinds of economic norms and ways of making a living. So it's not a new thing that we have a quote unquote crisis in masculinity. It's a recurring thing. It's how history works. Most people don't bring to the conversation in the current moment a historical view of all of this. They just think in the present tense. By the way, the example is the Boy Scouts, for example. The Boy Scouts was founded in the early 20th century in the UK by this man called Lord Baden-Powell, who was a military man who was worried about the feminizing effects of industrialization on young men and boys who were becoming soft, sloppy cigarette suckers, as he called them. And he instituted the Boy Scouts as an organization of paramilitary socialization of young men and boys to counteract the feminizing effects of industrialization. This is over 100 years ago in the UK. And then, by the way, it got imported over into the United States. And to this day, the Boy Scouts, or the Scouts, as it's now called, is a flashpoint of political and cultural war, if you will, controversy, because it is about how we define and identify manhood in an essential way.
Thank you. Another good answer. I think I'm going to take a couple of questions from the chats. Most of the comments, Jackson and Katz, are thank you, thank you, thank you for a terrific talk, a powerful talk. We need this. But there are some questions. And one of them is have you done any research about sexual abuse and violence among same-sex partners?
Yes, but I can't say it's my sort of expert area. I certainly know that when it comes to sexual violence, men's sexual violence against other men, which I didn't talk about in my talk, is a huge problem in the world and in human civilization. I mean, men commit the overwhelming majority of sexual violence, whether the victims are women, which they are in approximately 90% of cases, or men, which they are in approximately 10% of cases, or non-binary folks. The perpetrators, the people who commit the overwhelming majority of sexual violence, including the sexual abuse of children, the overwhelming majority of them are men. That's just a fact. It's not a debatable point. And so because the same system. Well, let me back up. There are dynamics that overlap, and there's dynamics that don't overlap in terms of same-sex versus heterosexual sexual violence. But one thing that is the most important thing that overlaps is that men are the ones doing it in the vast majority of cases, and I think that has to be looked into. Can I say also, Naomi, I forgot to mention this in the previous answer to the previous question. Sarah Lennox is one of the great figures in my time at UMass, and not just my time, but over the last, many decades. The social thought and political economy department at UMass is an important sort of intellectual political institution at UMass. And I have several friends who are graduates of the department and who have gone out into the world using many of their ideas and inspiration, intellectual and political and every other way to change the world. I often say that what happens in the valley doesn't stay in the valley, because so much of what we do, those of us who are educators and activists in the academy, we might be based in a small, or you all might be based in a small, relatively small area, but the world is a big place, and tons of people all over the world had some of their formative years in the Pioneer Valley, intellectually, politically, and personally, and I'm one of them. So thank you, Sarah, and your colleagues.
And thank you for that, Jackson. I think Sarah's here and she's probably smiling. The next question is from Helen Seidler, and it's the emotional life of boys, it seems to me, is not acknowledged. Isn't it in childhood when we learn how to identify and regulate our emotions and to understand how fundamental emotions are to all relationships? Where do emotions fit into the conversation?
No, great question. Again, this is based goes back to basic feminism 101. If you divide humans into two categories, again, for the sake of this discussion, this binary categories, men and women, and then you carve up a set of characteristics and you assign certain characteristics to one gender or the other, and say that for example, emotional sensitivity, emotional literacy, relational skill, those are feminine qualities. Then you're going to de-emphasize training boys and men in developing those qualities. And so the whole idea of creating this artificial binary where you divide up human characteristics in this way is itself is part of the problem. But and we have, by the way, we have made progress over the past generation or two. This gets really tricky, and I was trying to think of how to address this in a talk of 30 minutes. It's like it's kind of impossible. It's sort of like a TED talk. It's like you have to say so much in so little of time, but there's a complicated picture that's happening. On one hand, there are young men who are growing up today who have come of age over the last generation who have much more acceptance of LGBTQ diversity and gender fluidity, and they've grown up with women as their friends and peers, and in ways that my generation didn't have, frankly, anywhere near as much. And that's all good because it represents, I think, a step forward, big step forward for humanity. But at the same time, there's been a big backlash, and right now there's an incredibly important backlash that's been taking place not just in the United States, but all over the world among Gen Z men, young men, many of whom grew up in completely online spaces. And obviously the COVID pandemic had something to do with that generational cohort's experience of atomization and living at home, if you will, online the whole time. But there's a real big divide that has emerged between young men and women, because young women are much more likely to identify as feminist and as aspirational to doing a whole range of things in life. I know that there's also a backlash movement that's trying to pull those women back into trad wife, if you will, or more traditional ideologies of femininity. But there is a big divide among young generations about their understanding of feminism, their understanding of gender equality, how far we've come, how far we need to go. And a lot of young men, I just read a survey, it was a multinational survey, a lot of young men who are now 20 years old or 23 years old have more conservative views on gender and feminism than baby boomer men. That's not the way it should be, right? It shouldn't be that way. But so that means there is a crisis. I would say that's a crisis, that young men who are identifying feminism as their antagonist rather than sort of understanding that it's part of evolutionary change in the human species and it's part of the Enlightenment project of increasing fairness, justice, and equality. But as I said in my talk, we have to explicitly say to young men that we want you to be part of the changes, the evolutionary changes, the transformations, that it's calling men in to good behavior and to aspirational behavior and justice and fairness, rather than always calling them out for bad behavior. Because if men see themselves as always being hunkered in a defensive crouch against being attacked, that's not how you're going to make forward progress. And when people would say to me, I'm just give you this quick thing. People would say to me, this is now years ago, during maybe it was even while Trump was running for president the first time, but certainly through the years of Trump, people would say to me, well, why do we have to focus on men? Why do we have to focus on young men, especially young white men? It's like they've been on center stage the whole time throughout Western history. Isn't it time that we push them aside and center other people? And I say, okay, I understand the sentiment. I appreciate the sentiment, but I just have 3 words for you. President Donald Trump. In other words, you have to be smart and savvy, because then Donald Trump gets elected based on some of these sentiments, and then has enormous power to roll back all the progress that we've been making in gender justice and in LGBTQ justice and racial justice. So we have to be smart and savvy about this. It's not just about helping young men. It's about saving democracy and saving the advances that we've been making over the past generation or two.
Great answer. I have one more question. several questions on my list, and they're more on the chat. So why don't I ask this question, and then if people want to stay a few more minutes, if that's okay with you, we can. We can't stay too long, but we can stay a few more. So the question is from Sarah Backrack, who is the current chair of the Speakers Committee and a really important member of our community. And she has a two-part question, one very general. Is misogyny socially developed or hormonal? I don't know if you can answer that so quickly, but and then she asks, how stressful is it for men who aren't misogynists to be themselves?
Well, I cannot speak to any biological roots of misogynist behavior. I would lean more heavily on the nurture side of the nature nurture binary. And by the way, nature nurture is such a simple-minded and false binary. All human behavior is a complex stew of biological factors and genetic factors and sociological and economic and political and historical and individual experience. In other words, what people choose to focus on might be something idiosyncratic to them in terms of what is most important to look at, but all human behavior and the organization of societies is too complicated to reduce it to any one thing. And I think there is this tendency towards the biologization of everything, a sociological term, right? The idea that somehow everything is rooted in biology and ultimately it's a genetic question. I don't subscribe to that at all. And by the way, I do think that there's one way of thinking about the evolutionary question. I know this is going further afield than the original question, but I do think that there's a way to think about this subject matter in evolutionary terms, which is to say, one of the basic precepts of Darwinian evolution is that the most successful species, or the successful species, are the ones who figure out a way to successfully adapt to the realities of their local environment. And I would say that men who are always looking backwards to the older, to the past for models of, masculinity, when men were kings, when men were in control, we didn't have problems. This backward looking, which is a right-wing sort of turn to look backwards to try to recapture something that's been lost, make America great again, etc. That's counter to evolutionary thinking, which is we live in the present and the world is as it is now. And we have to figure out how to successfully adapt to the changes rather than pretend that we can go back to some imagined, romantic past. And so for evolutionary reasons, I think men need to get on board with, feminist change and gender justice, because I think that's critical for the future of our species. I literally think that. And this isn't just about individual men's feelings. This is about the future of our species. And the other question, I'm sorry, the second part of it was about misogyny.
Men who aren't misogynists, how stressful is it for them?
Oh, I mean, I don't know. Life is stressful for everybody, right? And I do think I would say, I'm not saying this is totally responsive to the spirit of that question, but I would say we all have to make a choice about how much we're going to participate in perpetuating systems of injustice in a patriarchal culture, or how much we're going to resist them. And there is a cost to resisting. And part of the reason why men don't speak up, I talk about this at some length in my book, Every Man. There's a reason why so few men have been distinguished as leaders on the subject matter of gender violence prevention, sexual assault, and everything else, and including very otherwise powerful, impressive men. Very little leadership from these men. And there's a reason for it. There are a number of reasons for it, but one of them is it's hard. You're not necessarily going to get high fives from your buddies. You know what I'm saying? If you're taking a stand, if you're a man or a young man who speaks out about sexism, who speaks out about misogyny in your peer culture, you're taking a risk. And just like, by the way, a victim or a survivor of abuse often decides not to say anything, not to do anything, because they know that potential negative consequences of speaking out might even be worse than just living with the initial violation, right? Well, that's also true of bystanders. It's also true of members of peer cultures. They look around and they think, you know what? I see something wrong, but if I speak up, it's going to come back negatively on me. And is it really worth it? And, and is it worth taking that risk? And in the absence, by the way, in the absence of a public conversation that urges them to do it, that models by adult men doing that kind of behavior, and a narrative that says that the man or the young man who speaks out is a strong man, not a simp or a beta male or a cuck, and all these terminology that young men hear to describe men like me. This is the kind of terms that men like me get saddled with, that we're betas and simps and white knights and and virtue signalers and all this kind of stuff. And in the absence of a positive and frankly, well, in the absence of a narrative that says that actually it takes more guts to speak up if you're a young man or a man who challenges your friends, that takes more guts than to just be one of the guys and going along with your boys. In the absence of that public conversation, a lot of young men and older men are not going to feel like it's worth taking the risk that you do take if you do speak out against misogyny.
Thank you. Another great answer. I'm sorry, I seem to have lost my camera. Can you hear me?
You can hear you.
Yeah, I am not in Massachusetts, so my camera's sort of in an awkward position. But I think for those of you who want to depart, because it's after four, please do. And we have a couple more questions,
Okay.
and we can't stay too long, but we can stay for a couple more questions if I can see those. Um, hmm, where did they go? Nina, are you there?
Yes, do you want me to look in the chat?
Yeah, why don't you do that? Because my screen is misbehaving. Sorry about that, everybody. And let me just say before I go away, uh, you've done a great job. Thank you. Powerful, terrifying, wonderful. And
Thanks.
that there were most of the chats were saying just that. And Sarah Lennox piped up and said, thank you.
You're very welcome. By the way, while you're looking, Nina, one thing I didn't talk about, and I'll just just make sure that it's on the public record, is that religion is an important site for this struggle, and the white evangelical Christian movement in this country has been incredibly at the forefront of trying to roll back feminist progress, and they're extraordinarily well funded and they're extraordinarily well resourced, and they have tens of thousands of pastors and preachers and ministers who have a weekly platform on Sundays. They have whole communities where they're incredibly influential at sort of narrating the world, and part of their narration of the world is that some of the problems that we have in American society in the in the early 21st century here are connected to men's declining status in the family and in the larger society. So a big part of their push is they use scripture, or they use their interpretation of scripture to try to enforce a very reactionary or backward-looking notion of men's centrality. And the late Charlie Kirk was an incredibly effective representative of that. If you saw his memorial service, the Charlie Kirk memorial service, it was very much an evangelical, right-wing, white evangelical Christian revival kind of meeting service, because Charlie Kirk, a big part of his political persona and his persuasive ability was to say to young men that they needed to sort of take back control, using the biblical reference point as one of his main ideological pillars. So that has to be, and it's a hugely important part of the constituency that elected Donald Trump and then reelected him. So talking about not just about religion, but about the specifically conservative and reactionary gender beliefs of religious right-wing Christians in this country, Christians, is an important turn, and I hope people are interested in that as well. Did anybody?
Nina, and I think this is probably an important, we can't go on too much longer anyway, so this is probably an important place to end on a critique of evangelical religion. So thank you all for coming. I'm sorry if I'm really sorry I missed some of your terrific questions. You might want to shoot them over and we can send them if you'd like. And I hope we see you in our next talk. Thank you.
Thanks,
Talk to
Naomi.
everybody.
Thanks, everybody. And I appreciate your being part of this. I appreciate me being part of it, and I appreciate you tuning in today. Thank you.